Now Caesar breaks off his narrative at this point to give us a big section, a big long section, all about first the customs and institutions of the Gauls, and then another all about the customs and institutions of the Germans, before continuing with the actual war narrative. So, let me read you these paragraphs. Caesar tells us, quote, "At this point, it seems not inappropriate to give an account of the customs of the Gauls and the Germans and the differences between these peoples. In Gaul, not only every tribe, canton and subdivision of a canton, but almost every family is divided into rival factions. At the head of these factions are men who are regarded by their followers as having particularly great prestige, and these have the final say on all questions that come up for judgment and in all discussions of policy. The object of this ancient custom seems to have been to ensure that all the common people should have protection against the strong, for each leader sees that no one gets the better of his supporters by force or by cunning, or if he fails to do so, is utterly discredited. The same principle holds good in intertribal politics. All the tribes are grouped in two factions. At the time of Caesar's arrival, these were headed respectively by the Aedui and the Sequani. As the Aedui had long enjoyed very great prestige and had many satellite tribes, the Sequani were the weaker of the two, depending on their own resources. They therefore secured the alliance of Ariovistus and his Germans at the cost of heavy sacrifices and the promise of still further concessions. And that was years ago. That was well over 10 years ago that took place. Then, as a result of several victories in which all the Aeduians of rank were killed, the Sequani became so much stronger than their rivals that they were able to bring over to their side a considerable part of the Aeduian dependencies, and make the Aeduians surrender the sons of their chiefs as hostages, and swear to form no hostile designs against the Sequani. They had also seized and retained a part of the Aeduian territory that lay near their own frontier, and had in fact established a hegemony over the whole of Gaul. Reduced to this extremity, Dividiacus the Aeduian, remember him, went to Rome to solicit aid from the Senate and returned without success. And that was in 61 BC, so again, quite a few years ago. Caesar continues here. Caesar's arrival changed the situation. The Aedui had their hostages restored to them, and not only regained their former dependencies, but acquired new ones with Caesar's help, because those who became their allies found that they were better off and more equitably governed than before. In other respects too, their influence and standing were enhanced, and the Sequani lost their supremacy. Their place was taken by the Remi, and as it was known that they stood as high in Caesar's favour as the Aedui, tribes which on account of old feuds could not be induced to join the Aedui were placing themselves under the protection of the Remi, who, by taking good care of them, were able to maintain the unaccustomed power that they had suddenly acquired. At this time, therefore, the position was that, while the Aedui were acknowledged to be easily ahead of all the other tribes, the Remi came next in importance. Everywhere in Gaul, there were only two classes of men who are of any account or consideration. The common people are treated almost as slaves, never venture to act on their own initiative, and are not consulted on any subject. Most of them, crushed by debt or heavy taxation, or the oppression of more powerful persons, bind themselves to serve men of rank, who exercise over them all the rights that masters have over slaves. The two privileged classes are the Druids and the Knights. The Druids officiate at the worship of the gods, regulate public and private sacrifices, and give rulings on all religious questions. Large numbers of young men flock to them for instruction, and they are held in great honour by the people. They act as judges in practically all disputes, whether between tribes or between individuals. When any crime is committed, or a murder takes place, or a dispute arises about an inheritance or a boundary, it is they who adjudicate the matter and appoint the compensation to be paid and received by the parties concerned. Any individual or tribe failing to accept their reward is banned from taking part in sacrifice, the heaviest punishment that can be inflicted upon a Gaul. Those who are laid under such a ban are regarded as impious criminals. Everyone shuns them and avoids going near or speaking to them, for fear of taking some harm by contact with that which is unclean. If they appear as plaintiffs, justice is denied them, and they are excluded from a share of any honour. All the Druids are under one head, whom they hold in the highest respect. On his death, if any one of the rest is of outstanding merit, he succeeds to the vacant place. If several have equal claims, the Druids usually decide the election by voting, though sometimes they actually fight it out. On a fixed date in each year, they hold a session in a consecrated spot in the country of the Carnutes, which is supposed to be the centre of Gaul. Those who are involved in disputes assemble here from all parts, and accept the Druids' judgments and awards. The Druidic doctrine is believed to have been found existing in Britain and thence imported into Gaul. Even today, those who want to make a profound study of it generally go to Britain for the purpose. The Druids are exempt from military service and do not pay taxes like other citizens. These important privileges are naturally attractive. Many present themselves of their own accord to become students of Druidism, and others are sent by their parents or relatives. It is said that these pupils have to memorize a great number of verses, so many that some of them spend 20 years at their studies. The Druids believe that their religion forbids them to commit their teachings to writing. A real shame for the historian, that. Although for most other purposes, such as public and private accounts, the Gauls used the Greek alphabet. But I imagine that this rule was originally established for other reasons, because they did not want their doctrine to become public property, and in order to prevent their pupils from relying on the written word and neglecting to train their memories. For it is usually found that when people have the help of texts, they are less diligent in learning by heart, and let their memories rust. A lesson which they take particular pains to inculcate is that the soul does not perish, but after death passes from one body to another. They think that this is the best incentive to bravery, because it teaches men to disregard the terrors of death. They also hold long discussions about the heavenly bodies and their movements, the size of the universe and of the earth, the physical constitution of the world, and the power and properties of the gods, and they instruct the young men in all these subjects. That sounds to me exactly like the sort of thing that the classical Greek philosophers, classical Athenian philosophers, the pre-Socratics, Socrates himself, Plato, Aristotle, sounds exactly like the sort of thing they talked about, the beginnings of a philosophy. Season continues. The second class is that of the knights. When their services are required in some war that has broken out, and before Caesar's arrival in the country, the Gallic states used to fight offensive or defensive wars almost every year, these all take the field, surrounded by their servants and retainers, of whom each knight has a greater or smaller number according to his birth and fortune. The possession of such a following is the only criterion of position and power that they recognise. So the number of retainers or men-at-arms that you can personally bring to a battlefield. As a nation, the Gauls are extremely superstitious, and so persons suffering from serious diseases, as well as those who are exposed to the perils of battle, offer, or vow to offer, human sacrifices, for the performance of which they employ druids. They believe that the only way of saving a man's life is to propitiate the god's wrath by rendering another life in its place, and they have regular state sacrifices of the same kind. Some tribes have colossal images made of wickerwork, the limbs of which they fill with living men. They are then set on fire, and the victims burnt to death. They think that the gods prefer the execution of men taken in the act of theft or brigandage, or guilty of some offence. But when they run short of criminals, they do not hesitate to make up with innocent men. The god they reverence most is Mercury. They have very many images of him, and regard him as the inventor of all arts, the god who directs men upon their journeys, and their most powerful helper in trading and getting money. Next to him, they reverence Apollo, Mars, Jupiter, and Minerva, about whom they have much the same ideas as other nations. That Apollo averts illness, and Minerva teaches the principles of industries and handicrafts. That Jupiter is king of the gods, and Mars the lord of war. When they have decided to fight a battle, they generally vow to Mars the booty that they hope to take, and after a victory they sacrifice the captured animals and collect the rest of the spoil in one spot. Among many of the tribes, high piles of it can be seen on consecrated ground, and it is an almost unknown thing for anyone to dare, in defiance of religious law, to conceal his booty at home or to remove anything placed on the piles. Such a crime is punishable by a terrible death under torture. The Gauls claim all to be descended from Father Dis, declaring that this is the tradition preserved by the Druids. For this reason, they measure periods of time not by days, but by nights, and in celebrating birthdays, the first of the month, and New Year's Day, they go on the principle that the day begins at night. As regards to other usages of daily life, the chief difference between them and other peoples is that their children are not allowed to go up to their fathers in public until they are old enough for military service. They regard it as unbecoming for a son who is still a boy to stand in his father's sight in a public place. Bit odd, that one. When a Gaul marries, he adds to the dowry that his wife bring with her a portion of his own property estimated to be of equal value. A joint account is kept, and the whole account and the profits which it earns are put aside, and when either dies, the survivor receives both shares together with the accumulated profits. Husbands have power of life and death over their wives as well as their children. When a high-born head of a family dies, his relatives assemble, and if the circumstances of his death are suspicious, they examine his widow under torture, as we examine slaves. If her guilt is established, she is consigned to the flames and put to death with the most cruel torments. Gallic funerals are splendid and costly for a comparatively poor country. Everything that the dead man is supposed to have been fond of, including even animals, is placed upon the pyre, and not long ago there were people still alive who could remember the time when slaves and retainers, known to have been beloved of their master, were burned with them at the conclusion of the funeral rites. The tribes which are considered to manage their affairs best have a law that if anyone hears from a neighbouring country any rumour or news that concerns the state, he is to communicate it to a magistrate without speaking of it to anyone else. For experience has shown that impulsive and ignorant persons are often frightened by false reports into subversive action and meddle with important affairs of state. The magistrates suppress what they think is advisable to keep secret and publish only what they deem is expedient for the people to know. The discussion of politics is forbidden except in a public assembly. So there you go, end quote. There you go. That's what Caesar had to say about the customs and institutions of the Gauls. And it's just great information. It's the sort of information archaeology isn't very good at telling us. And of course, Caesar's account is not entirely trustworthy and may well be biased. He might be making things up and lying. Most people think he almost certainly isn't, but, he might be. Nonetheless, these are extremely valuable passages for our view of the ancient world, Europe in the 1st century BC. Okay, so he now goes on to tell us a bit about the German customs and institutions. He says this, quote, "The customs of the Germans are entirely different. They have no druids to control religious observances and are not much given to sacrifices. The only beings they recognise as gods are things that they can see and by which they are obviously benefited, such as sun, moon and fire. The other gods they have never even heard of. They spend all their lives in hunting and warlike pursuits, and inure themselves from childhood to toil and hardship." Tacitus says very similar things in his Germania, 150-odd years later. "Those who preserve their chastity longest are most highly commended by their friends, for they think that continence makes young men taller, stronger, and more muscular. To have had intercourse with a woman before the age of 20 is considered perfectly scandalous. They attempt no concealment, however, of the facts of sex. Men and women bathe together in the rivers, and they wear nothing but hides or short garments of hairy skin, which leave most of the body bare. The Germans are not agriculturalists, and live principally on milk, cheese and meat. No one possesses any definite amount of land as private property. The magistrates and tribal chiefs annually assign a holding to clans and groups of kinsmen or others living together, fixing its size and position at their discretion, and the following year make them move to somewhere else. They give many reasons for this custom. For example, that their men may not get accustomed to living in one place, lose their warlike enthusiasm and take up agriculture instead. That they may not be anxious to acquire large estates, and the strong be tempted to dispossess the weak. To prevent their paying too much attention to building houses that will protect them from cold and heat, or becoming too fond of money, a frequent cause of division and strife. And to keep the common people contented and quiet by letting every man see that even the most powerful are not better off than himself. The various tribes regard it as their greatest glory to lay waste as much as possible of the land around them and to keep it uninhabited. They hold it, these dead zones we talked about before, these massive dead zones. They hold it a proof of a people's valour to drive their neighbours from their homes so that no one dare settle near them, and also think it gives them greater security by removing any fear of sudden invasion. When a tribe is attacked or intends to attack another, officers are chosen to conduct the campaign and invested with powers of life and death. In peacetime, there is no central magistracy. The chiefs of the various districts and cantons administer justice and settle disputes among their own people. No discredit attaches to plundering raids outside the tribal frontiers. The Germans say that they serve to keep the young men in training and prevent them from getting lazy. When a chief announces in an assembly his intention of leading a raid and calls for volunteers, those who like the proposal and approve of the man who makes it stand up and promise their assistance amid the applause of the whole gathering. Anyone who backs out afterwards is looked on as a deserter and a traitor, and no one will ever trust him again. To wrong a guest is impious in their eyes. They shield from injury all who come to their houses for any purpose whatever, and treat their persons as sacred. Guests are welcome to every man's home and table. There was a time when the Gauls were more warlike than the Germans, when they actually invaded German territory and sent colonists across the Rhine because their own country was too small to support its large population. It was in this way that the most fertile district of Germany, in the neighbourhood of the Hercynian forest, was seized and occupied by the Volcae, who remain there to this day and have a higher reputation for their fair dealing and gallantry. Nowadays, while the Germans still endure the same life of poverty and privation as before, without any change in their diet or clothing, the Gauls, through living near the Roman province and becoming acquainted with seaborne products, are abundantly supplied with various commodities. Gradually accustomed to inferiority and defeated in many battles, they do not even pretend to compete with the Germans in bravery. This Hercynian forest is so wide that it takes a lightly equipped traveller 9 days to cross it. This is the only way the Germans have of estimating its size, as they know nothing of measures of length. Starting from the frontiers of the Helvetii, Nemetes and Raurasi, it runs straight along the Danube to the country of the Dacians and the Enates. At this point it turns northeast away from the river, and in its huge length extends through the territories of many different peoples. No Western German claims to have reached its eastern extremity, even after travelling for 2 months, or to have heard where it ends. The forest is known to contain many kinds of animals not seen elsewhere, some of which seem worthy of mention because they differ greatly from those found in other countries. There is an ox shaped like a deer, with a single horn in the middle of its forehead, between the ears, which sticks up higher and straighter than those of the animals we know, and at the top branches out widely like a man's hand or a tree. The male and female are alike, and their horns are of the same shape and size. There are also animals called elks, which resemble goats in shape and in their piebald colouring, but are somewhat larger and have stunted horns and legs without joints or knuckles. They do not lie down to rest, and if they fall by accident, cannot get up or raise themselves from the ground. Trees serve them as resting places. They support themselves against the trunks and rest in that way, leaning over only slightly. When the hunters have found out their usual retreats by following their tracks, they either sever the roots of all the surrounding trees or cut nearly through the trunks, so that they only look as if they were still standing firm. When the elks lean against them as usual, they push over the insecure trunks with their weight and fall down with them. Very odd little story, that. A third species is the aurochs, an animal somewhat smaller than the elephant, with the appearance, colour and shape of a bull. They are very strong and agile, and attack every man and beast they catch sight of. The natives take great pains to trap them in pits and then kill them. The arduous sport toughens the young men and keeps them in training, and those who kill the largest number exhibit the horns in public to show what they have done and earn high praise. It is impossible to domesticate or tame the aurochs, even if it is caught young. The horns are much larger than those of our oxen and of quite different shape and appearance. The Germans prize them greatly. They mount the rims with silver and use them as drinking cups at their grandest banquets." End quote. So again, that's all Caesar tells us about the Germans. Everyone would have hoped for more, but still, some of those things are funny and interesting, and of course, not quite right. It puts me in mind of someone like Pliny, who wrote about the natural world a lot, about far-flung countries he'd obviously never seen and animals he'd obviously never seen. And a lot of it is just sort of fanciful nonsense. But he's not trying to be a liar. He's just, like Herodotus, just telling us what he's heard. But Caesar is supposed to have seen all these things, you would have thought. And it's still something like a unicorn he's describing there.
If you would like to see the full version of this premium video, please head over to lotuseaters.com and subscribe to gain full access to all of our premium content.